What are cryptocurrencies?
Hey, hey, hey.
What are NFTs?
A non-fungible token.
Time to buy Bitcoin.
Bitcoin just seems like a scam.
What's up, Bitcoin?
So we're here today with Dr. Aris Komporozos-Athanasiou. How did I do?
Excellent.
From this point forward, I think I'll call you Aris, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I would prefer that.
And we're here today because I recently finished Aris's book entitled Speculative Communities. And the subtitle of that is Living with Uncertainty in a Financialized World. I actually don't remember how I found my way to your book. So if any of our listeners were the kind soul who turned me on to this book, please raise your hand and remind me. But to me, just, given what I think about all day in terms of, believing in the future of digital assets and also living in what feel like speculative communities. We spend a lot of time in, discords, alpha groups, these groups really speculating as little weird communities and often speculating on things like JPEGs. And so the title of the book, grabbed me. And then, the book was, for me, a very fascinating and often challenging extension of the theories that I've had for 20 plus years about the way the internet is changing humanity. I've been saying for a long period of time that, I consider myself, a student of the way technology changes culture. And fundamentally, your book is about that. What I found, incredibly interesting is that you have, a book called Speculative Communities in 2022, and it talks about, the way that humanity is actually evolving into a species of speculators in a way. And you can tell me if I've overstepped there. But you actually don't venture into the realm of digital assets or any of these things, but it feels quite related. So I was really excited to talk to you, and I think our audience would really benefit from understanding the ideas that you put forward in the book. And then I wanted to see what we might extrapolate for that into the world of digital assets, because I believe, the same way that in the year 2000, the internet was both, let's say, undeniably the future and also a bit overhyped. Digital assets kind of fall into that same category of being, kind of undeniably a part of the lives of future humans, but, we don't know exactly what role they'll play. So I'm trying to connect those dots, and really your book provided me a lot of framework and tools to think about those things. So with that long introduction, maybe you could tell the audience, what this work is and how you came about it.
Yeah, thank you, Jan, for this very kind introduction and all the thoughts that on the book that you shared with me. And it's really, it's fantastic to be here. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation because, as you were saying, there's something in the book. The book is an attempt to, it's a sociological kind of piece of work, and it's an attempt to kind of capture the moment and that we live in. And it's philosophical and theoretical, and that it has political implications. But there are aspects of it that resonate with your work and your theories of, like you were saying, digital life and digital assets that I'm also very interested in understanding better. So I'm really glad to hear about those resonances. But yeah, just to give you a sense of what motivated me to write the book. Maybe, and actually to link this a bit to some of your comments about technology and the internet, a lot of the motivation for writing the book has to do with a sense of frustration with popular critics. And I'm a sociologist and a social theorist, political theorist, and a lot of the critical thinking around contemporary politics, and specifically the use of technologies in contemporary politics, tends to be quite veering towards a demonization of new technologies, or on the other end of the spectrum, a kind of utopian, naive embracing of those technologies as kind of the instruments of revolution and a radically new future. So I wanted to sort of put forward an argument about how our contemporary moment of uncertainty, of radical uncertainty, is mediated through new technologies. And I was thinking here at the level of everyday life, social media, things like Twitter and Instagram and TikTok, but also things like dating apps, things like astrology apps, more on the obscure end of digital social media, media that connects us, but it's often seen as yet another manifestation of kind of capitalist surveillance capitalism, the Zuboff argument that we're just merely passive users of those media, isolated, fragmented, individualized. And there's something about this narrative that doesn't quite feel right. I don't, and I see this with my students. I teach 18 to 21-year-olds here at UCL in London. And yes, it's true, they're consumed by their phones and, they seem distracted and so on. But I wouldn't say they're apolitical or isolated. They seem to just be forming a different kind of community that doesn't necessarily look like what we expect it to look like. And I guess part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to, rather than provide an alternative look, an alternative theory of our contemporary moment, I'm trying to kind of scratch beneath the surface of what is already out there, the kind of communities that are being created through our engagement with those new technologies in our everyday lives, and maybe provide an alternative language to use to capture those connections. So to summarize, connections and relations and the social aspect is at the heart of what I'm trying to capture in the book. And I suppose to just one final thing in terms of speculation, I see speculation projected into that social realm. So I'm not interested in the speculative in the sense of just mere gambling, and this kind of negatively connoted the individual gambler, risk taker type of figure that we often get in again, another demonizing kind of narrative about financial capitalism. I'm interested in what kind of speculations can emerge out of collective endeavors and how speculation in that sense can become a vehicle for community. So yeah, maybe that gives you a bit of a sense of that, the background for writing the book.
Yeah, and I think that, let's focus on the word speculation for a moment. You start the book with kind of a definition of speculation and ultimately speculative communities. And I think that might be the first hurdle for people to get over, is the one that you just mentioned, because when you think about speculation, as you said, there's a sort of negative connotation to it, which is about gambling, effectively. And again, for our listeners, you aren't talking about speculation in the way that say I'm doing on NFTs on a daily basis. You're talking about the decisions that people are making using their everyday, what is today everyday technology, like Instagram, like TikTok, like Tinder. So tell us what you mean, by speculation in that context, just so people can really try to get their heads around what you mean by speculation, because I think they might have in mind gambling on an asset instead of the kind of attention speculation that is more what you're describing in the book.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great question. And I also think it's important to try and give some clarity there. So the way I would distinguish speculation, or what I call in the book the speculative imagination, from something like individual gambling or kind of taking on risk, or exhibiting kind of looking for opportunities through risk taking, like one does in kind of, going into the casino, or indeed some forms of financial risk taking. There's something about speculation that relates to uncertainty rather than risk. So uncertainty is the key vehicle, but also resource to engage in speculative endeavors. What do I mean by that, and why the distinction is important? So risk is something that can be calculated. Risk is something that can be probabilistically kind of controlled, estimated. And so there is the implication that taking on risk, there is something calculative about it. There's something that implies control, some form of control, right? And where, on the other hand, uncertainty, and indeed radical forms of uncertainty, sit with the unknown and that which cannot be probabilistically predicted, and in that sense, with the future, with the unknowability of the future. And there are two sides of that coin of unknowability. The one side is the somewhat sort of even distressing or negative feeling of the sense that, we have no control over the future, over our future. And that can leave folks profoundly feeling insecure. And there's something quite debilitating, perhaps, with not knowing what the future holds and accepting that we cannot ever know, despite of our best technologies, right? But there is also the other side of this, which is the openness of unknowability of the future. So if the future is unknown, it means that we can shape it, right? It also means that the dominant narratives about what the future looks like that we have available through existing models of, say, capitalist economy, we might be able to challenge those, right? And so there might always be more than one pathways to take. And I find that aspect of uncertainty often missed in our discussions about speculation. So I see speculation as an attempt to look at uncertainty in the eye, to kind of, rather than attempt to control it, to put a number on it and try to calculate it, an attempt to kind of go with the wave, like enter the wave, ride that wave of uncertainty, immerse oneself into the unknown, kind of dwell in that space of the unknown rather than try to kind of avoid it. And I see that, as you say, and in the book, I talk a lot about our day-to-day lives. And I see that as a sociologist, as a behavior that manifests itself in the way we deal with things like our day-to-day decisions to do with, the way we form relations, the way we consume content in social media. I'm interested in dating apps, for example, because unlike the narrative that we get that dating apps are just a symptom of our disconnected time, that we're just all very alone and just consumed in our screens, I see in that an embracing of uncertainty. So and I think, and importantly, I say in the book, when we all swipe, in the act of swiping, we're not just merely alone. We imagine ourselves as part of a community of swipers. Yeah. So that fascinates me. I think there's something that is quite generative in that kind of collective embracing of the unknown. So that's just one example. But then, of course, there are other realms, and indeed to do more with markets and what kind of markets can facilitate that more open-ended type of speculation, that living with the unknown rather than against the unknown principle.
I think you're right. The dating app example is a great one because again, you're putting a theory out there which does fly in the face of what kind of the contemporary narrative is. Like you said, the contemporary narrative is that we're so lonely, and so it's why we're turning to these apps, and you put forth something different. And again, tell me if I get this right, but I found it really fascinating. And you just sort of alluded to both. One is that that gives us a feeling of control in the face of uncertainty. And the other is that, as you just said, we are still a part of a community of swipers, right? It's a community where the kind of the symbols, I think, as you say, are just different. They're different than the ones that maybe my generation had or my parents' generation had, but they are still. It's not that we're disconnected. We're just we are connected in a different way. And I think the question I'd like to get at in that, apart from just, do I have you correct on that, is, the internet has brought us this, I guess, is my question, because I've always thought of what the internet did fundamentally is it unlocked consumer choice, right? I mean, when I grew up, I had, the FM spectrum and the number of channels on television and the magazines I could get at the local store, and now we have this unlimited choice. So the internet has brought kind of unlimited distribution of information. But what you're saying is that unlimited choice has actually created a new human. I mean, you actually you say we've gone from Homo economicus to Homo speculus, right? So that's pretty makes sense to me, actually, because it certainly feels like there's a before and after. But you're getting at the heart, I think, of what some of those changes are. So I guess I'm curious, like it's really just TCP/IP that has brought us to this, on some level, like this reconnection of humanity, or am I oversimplifying?
Yeah, no, this is a very, very interesting question, Ian. And what I would say is that the internet is a big part of it. In the book, I locate the origins of this shift that you just described between this figure of the Homo economicus to what I call the Homo speculans. I located.
What is that the key difference for people?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the Homo economicus is a very kind of prevalent label that economists primarily have used to describe rational economic behavior. So it's a kind of oversimplification of the individual agent within an economy who is seen as a maximizer of their utility through their everyday decisions. So their decisions are binary and they're driven by their rationality, and that's how they operate. And this is the kind of model of human behavior that is modeled into the mainstream economics. And
so we could say that that's the post-war pre-internet human.
Yeah, I think we can say that. And I mean, it's probably its origins are even before the war. I guess you can say that's over 150 years. But I would say it still persists. I mean, in the accounts, in our mainstream understandings, and in kind of media, all of mainstream media accounts of how markets operate, mainstream economists still, I mean, what they've done is they're moving to add aspects to that Homo economicus and say, okay, it's not just everyone's rational, people have limited rationality. So, it's not always fully rational what they do. We need to account for their emotions, for example. But the model still remains quite binary and quite limited. But my claim is that with things like financialization, so the increasingly financialized nature of our economies, which means that we're moving away from the material reality of asset trading to the much more virtual reality of looking into virtual assets, for instance, the stuff that you're interested in, and the realm of immaterial, right, that is removed from traditional modes of trading. That does something to this kind of stable and one-dimensional figure of Homo economicus. I think our very exposure to that more virtual reality, to that more unmoored reality from where we can grasp materially, makes us more open and more it nurses us into this more speculative mode of being that is more prone to accept uncertainty and hence not to act as utility maximizer, but to act in a way that looks for opportunity in what might seem confusing or disorienting or unstable. So that maximizing your efficiency implies a more stable narrative or seeking out stability. The speculative, this Homo speculans I described in the book, is meant to capture that more open-ended and more, if you like, opportunistic approach towards the uncertain the confusing. And just to go back to what digital media have done, I think a lot of what they've done, and the choice that you mentioned, consumer choice, it's true that we are bombarded and surrounded by information, by such amounts of data and information that we're clearly unable to process and manage. And that is disorienting, right? I think this element of confusion and disorientation is quite one that resonates with people. But the point about Homo speculans is that in that disorientation, in that confusion, we find also something comforting, and indeed something that allows us to connect through. And so the success of something like dating apps or TikTok, with this fast-paced, swiping of content, is not that it provides stability to us, is that it reflects back to us our very uncertain condition. And that's comforting, because what we see in the constant swiping is just a reflection of the world around us. So that feels like there is something appealing about that. And so, yeah, I'm that's something that I'm interested in a lot in this new remodeling I try to make of our contemporary behavior.
I think it's so interesting that because to me you're extrapolating from something that I feel. I always use media as the as the kind of easy descriptor. I spent 20 years in digital music, and that I watched that unfold, and I watched that change, right? I watched that change from kind of a hit on FM radio to a hit on TikTok eventually in the end. And I see that difference from the way that I grew up watching, the same episodes of Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island over and over and over and over, to seeing, people that would never watch the same thing twice, because, there's such an abundance of choice. And to your point there, the world is constantly reflecting itself at them, right? I mean, in so many ways, TikTok is like the television that I just turned on after school, except it's 100% personalized, hyper personalized, as opposed to hyper broadcast, right? I had very little choice of what to watch when I came home from school, and now someone who's coming home from school today has a channel that was made especially for them, and so what you're doing is sort of asking, all right, well, what are the sociological implications of that reality? Like, there's no question this is a different reality. What are the sociological implications of that? I think one thing I find fascinating is that you imply that the world today is somehow more uncertain, right? And I'm questioning, like, why? What makes today more uncertain than the world that I grew up in?
This is a difficult one, right? Because I don't want to suggest that there's been a sort of neat transition from a previous state of great security and stability to a current moment of total uncertainty. I don't think that would be accurate. Indeed, in the book, what I try to do is tell a longer story of the history of speculation and the history of financial capitalism, which I see starting in earnest in the late 19th century with the birth of the modern derivatives and futures contracts that change hands in the Chicago Board of Trade. And I see that as an interesting, and I don't want to be too technical there in terms of financial products and so on, but it's a fascinating moment in history, because for the first time you have this formalization of a kind of trading that is, like I was saying earlier, completely removed from the material reality of production of wheat and other oil and trading goods. And there's something about, and while that is happening, also what we have during that time in the late 19th century is this popularization, this attempt to democratize speculation, to make it a game for the many through what is called the bucket shops that were spreading in Chicago and other big American metropolis at the time. So you have the attempt of the everyday folks, and indeed those that were excluded from the formal exchanges, like people of color, women, farmers. They were able to go to these dingy kind of dens and that were projecting through the stock ticker what was going on inside the Chicago Board of Trade or Wall Street, and kind of place bets and so speculate with small amounts of money. And that spread like wildfire during the late 19th and early 20th century. And it's an important moment, I think, because it is for the first time, it shows the possibility of capitalizing on uncertainty. And there we're talking about the uncertainty of basically price movement, and that becomes something that many can sort of participate in. And in terms of, but to your question about what changes as we move forward, I mean, there is something, that moment historically is very important because it moves us to debates about what is legitimate speculation. How does the state, how do governments intervene or have to intervene into regulating that kind of type of speculation? And what we see is that as we enter the 20th century, courts and governments regulate against those bucket shops, so because they cast it as gambling, as immoral behavior, and they protect the big exchanges and what goes on within their walls as moral. And indeed, you know, what speculators do in those exchanges is they protect society because they take on unwanted risk. So they fulfill this social moral purpose. So we move to that in a more in an economy that is more regulated. And then in the book, I kind of trail how we enter sort of the post-war period of more stability in terms of financial trading and regulation. And then you have the 1970s, with the gradual deregulation of financial markets that reignites these more innovative kind of speculative behaviors within mainstream trading. I think what happens then is a combination of what you are suggesting, which is the arrival of the internet, of course, and the kind of connections and access that virtual spaces give to for everyday connections that include discussions and trading opportunities. But I think it's also something more. There's also something more insidious that is going on, which is the pace of financialization of our everyday life is such that we are constantly asked to see our lives as a process of managing risk and relating to uncertainty. You know, how we see our education as an asset, how we see, you know, housing as an asset. This is not just something that takes place in formal trading, but, you know, it's something that we viscerally, as in our everyday lives experience. And so there's something about that financialization of everyday life that leads us to that question of uncertainty. And it's not strictly speaking that uncertainty increases in that kind of outside realm, but it is that it seeps into our everyday life in ways that we have to confront it. And with the internet and with those new virtual tools, you get also a cultural layer of that uncertainty. You know, it becomes, you get an image, you get a representation of that uncertainty that is quite powerful. I'm not sure if I'm answering to your question.
I think that's
here.
great. Yeah, that helps me a lot in terms of understanding exactly what you mean, Bear. I think that concept of financialization of everyday life is, I like pointing these things out. I like the way that you bring these to the forefront, because I think they put a term, a sociological term perhaps, to something that we feel. You know, I feel it, and I'll tell you a very simple way that I feel it and have felt it in my life. You know, I'm 50 years old now. When I was, you know, let's say in my early 20s, you know, I was not a dumb person. I had a degree in computer science. I had a kid when I was a teenager, so I had some life experience. I had a job. I can also tell you, I did not know how to turn $500 into $1,500. Right. You know, for me, like the way that I got that value would be I'd go to work, and after, you know, 2 weeks, I would get a paycheck. Right. I feel now like every 21-year-old kid has a sense of how to turn $500 into $1,500. Right. I mean, I you know, if any of us, all of us have, you know, friends or, you know, kids of friends or nephews or nieces who you know, are in the world of sneaker trading. Their lives are denominated in something other than the local currency. Their lives are denominated in boxes of shoes that they trade online. The communities that they live in are communities of like-minded people. And to me, this is a financialization that I didn't experience at that age, which is just clearly a part of their lives, and maybe not a part of the life of every kid in college or high school. But every kid in college or high school, I promise you, knows one of these kids and knows that they live in their own world and their own community, and that community has its own economy, and that there are ups and downs and swings and good and bad, and Adidas is this and Nike is that, depending on the day of the week, right? So there, and I do see also with the way the internet has, it simply wouldn't be possible without, because the internet has collapsed the world into this world where, a 16-year-old kid can have a financial relationship, with someone in Japan, right? Which, wasn't possible for me when I was in high school, and can have it instantly. And then I don't think it's too far of a stretch to see, how that, jumps an order of magnitude again when suddenly that shoe is dematerialized, right, into a scarce digital good on a blockchain, which is part of an always on, always liquid, frictionless marketplace. Right. So I think that's the kind of the connection. I love that I love the idea of connecting that to the bucket shops in Chicago in the late 1800s, which are effectively bookies for the stock market. Right. So it's fast. That timeline is really fascinating to me. And I think it does actually point to how the internet has accelerated it. And also I think that what you're getting at is, and to answer, my question is, it's not necessarily more inherent uncertainty, but as you said, it's come to the foreground. It's become a part of my life. Again, and I think that's the key in what I mean by the sneaker example, is that if I were 21 years old today, financialization would be more a part of my life than it was when I was 21. And that's kind of what you're getting at, if I'm not mistaken.
100%. Yeah, I think you put it really, really beautifully there. Yes. And I want to just make a quick comment that I think is very important, a point that is very important to make. That, I mentioned already that what I try to do is kind of go against the narrative of demonizing speculation, demonizing new technologies. There's also another narrative that really bothers me, and I think is very inaccurate, which is that of crowd psychology and the irrational crowds. It's a very, very prominent label in financial thinking and in mainstream media. Again, we hear about manias and delusions, and how there are this irrational exuberance. There's a term, Greenspan was talking about that. So there is this derogatory, this way of deriding the irrationality of the many. And that originates all the way back to the 19th century again. It's the bucket shop gamblers, the immoral, irrational bucket shop gamblers, juxtaposed against the rational formal traders, who are the figure of the legitimate Homo economicus, right? That stands at the heart of American capitalism. And that travels with us, and it's still very prevalent today. If we look at how the discourse around, I suppose, crypto trading, for instance, and NFT trading, and the way in which, kind of retail trading, mimetic trading, it's often seen as, it's a fad, it's a Ponzi scheme, our critical sociological tools, to speak of my kind of profession, that we seem to me quite skewed and influenced by that deriding and kind of limiting view of looking at crowd behavior and fads, where there is other stuff going on. And that's the other stuff that I'm very interested in exploring. And I'm also interested in your thoughts on what you see there as potential, because from where I'm standing, I see things like I see things like storytelling, like sharing cultural experiences. What we can say, even making things like content that has mythical elements, or I look at conspiracy theories, for instance, as something that is, again, seen through the lens of, people just go crazy, they're irrational. I don't think that's, and if only we could educate them and show them the truth, show them the evidence of science. This is all great, but I think what conspiracy movements, how they attract people is because there is an element to playfully and play around the truth, and also connect in doing so, and create myths that are cool and often very problematic and very regressive, right? So I'm not endorsing QAnon here, but there are elements I want to say in that culture of contemporary speculative communities that are more, let's say, interesting and generative and possibly creative and playful than we give them credit for, and that interests me.
Yeah, I think that a couple of things I wanted to follow up on there. One, I'm curious how you think, because one thing that I've felt throughout this history of the way that the internet is changing culture, and actually if you talk to someone like Jeff Jarvis, who used to be the editor of People magazine, he would tell you it goes back further, that there was actually a point in the 80s when, because of cable television and VHS, and you started to go from kind of mass culture to what he called massive niches is the way that he put it. So you say speculative communities, but there's also some, and then in what you just said about the way these communities form, and they tell stories within these communities, there's also an increasing number of communities, right? I always make the claim that Discord actually in many ways represents society better than any other technology at the moment, because it is a collection of closed communities, right? They are each communities. There isn't a community. It's a collection of communities. So one thing is just this kind of increasing number of like-minded people gathering around something. If you're familiar with Balaji Srinivasan's work, The Network State, he sort of really plays this out, that we're moving from God to state to network, right? And that and that we're gathering our kind of our neighbors, our network neighbors, more than physical neighbors. I think the other thing that's interesting in what you just said, in that kind of counter narrative that you're providing, is, and I believe you say in the book that, instead of doom scrolling, people scroll because it brings them hope on some level. I like that. There was the Napoleon quote that our CEO told me recently, that, leaders define reality and give hope. Right. And so it's on some level, that's what we're getting when we're doom scrolling, a definition of reality and maybe hope, which is a counter narrative. It's called doom scrolling, right? Because it's supposed to be this like depressing pit that we're falling into. But you're saying, I think that you have a sort of a counter narrative to that. But I guess I'm curious, like, how to, where is the hope, and is that why we do it? Is that, in other words, I think you say, to come back to something like QAnon, people, they don't sort of go in for QAnon because they're simply because they're bananas. It's because they actually believe that this narrative brings a future that's better than yesterday on some level. And even though it's a niche perspective that wouldn't have had any airtime in a world with 3 television channels.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is really what I tried to describe with the notion of speculation that I'm sort of putting forward in the book, which is, if we were to use speculation then as a tool through which to understand the political moment, and things like conspiracy movements like QAnon, or even the more kind of regressive side of the kind of Trump type of populist and and his following, there is something about you get those critics, those explanations that say, look, this is all to do with an obsession with the past. It's all about folks looking for security in the past grand narrative of the nation state and the family and tradition, and that it's a return to the past that they crave. And I think that's inaccurate. And I think part of the success and the appeal of QAnon and some of those more conspiratorial movements is precisely that there's something about an image of the future that they project. there is a projection, there is a collective projection of an alternative reality, and I think gaming actually and LARPing and this gamification of our collective endeavors that you will see in conspiracy theories and conspiracy worlds, the very gamified worlds, is geared towards a future projection. And I think we often lose that. And speculation has these two sides, I think. One is the side of the openness of the future. The other side is it also provides security, right? It provides insurance. Like speculating is also, it has this dual aspect. You need a relative position of security from which to speculate on the openness of the future. And I think when I say security and insurance, I mean it also in the symbolic sense. So there is something about regressive conspiracy movements that take, they seek refuge to some security, like, nationalism, for instance. It's something that allows them to feel a sense of togetherness, but it's not complete. It's not the full story. That idea of stability allows them to then project into totally chaotic narratives. I mean, what is QAnon a stable narrative? It's totally, I mean, there's all sorts of narratives going up and down and fragmented. And my point is much like other aspects of our everyday life. It's very fragmented and very disorienting. It's nothing but stable. But it does give some hope. And to your question, where is the hope? I think this is a fascinating question, because the doom scrolling itself is not going to save us, right? But there's something, I think, about moving from our doom scrolling on an individual level to turning the doom scrolling into a political tool against the established centers of power, elites, and so on. And to give you an example here, because you spoke about networks and these kind of different communities that coalesce in this uncertain environment, I look at something like fandom communities, like K-pop, the Korean band music, and these fandom communities that are global, truly global and totally virtual through TikTok and so on. And there is something about the language that is developed in those fandom communities, and they're very young, these are teenagers or people in their 20s, and that fascinates me. Something about their approach to navigating those digital media and doing so politically often. So in the book, I talk about, towards the end of the book, I talk about this event in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when TikTokers, mostly from those fandom communities, sabotaged the Trump rally there, right? I think your listeners will know the story. There's something in the behaviors and in the practices that we see in those groups that specifically seek to stay within that space of confusion and disorientation that I find fascinating and very generative. And this is the transition from merely the world of just trading in a speculative way to a way of doing politics in a more speculative way that I think, there is hope in there. And so, in other words, rather than trying to make a point about showing the truth or exposing your political opponent weaknesses or fallacies, you add to the confusion. You cultivate even more disorientation as a political tool that can create opportunities. And I think there's something fascinating in that. And also, there's something playful. There's something that can be also fun. And these are elements that we tend to forget in this, to go back to the figure of Homo economicus, the rational utility maximizer. There's no fun in that. So, yeah, I don't know if that gives you a bit of a sense.
I mean, I love it, because to me, you're drawing this line between, the concept that Yuval Harari would talk about, of the fact that humans are story-consuming creatures, through to kind of these, network communities that Balaji might talk about, and then, kind of the application of that is that they become, in their own way, a speculative community. And I think, and the thing I'd like to turn to now is the fact that you've covered this concept of speculative communities without ever really covering speculation, right? And what I mean, now you've covered it, the ways that we speculate, but what I mean is you've covered financialization of society, and you've covered a speculative community without covering the speculation on specific assets, in particular digital assets, even though there's no talk of sneaker trading either, which is, I think, and also, whether it's discogs.com for vinyl, or, all of the sneaker trading sites, or et cetera, there's a certain kind of there's a way of speculating online, and those are to me, that whether it's discogs.com or a sneaker trading site or OpenSea, they're all kind of communities that have speculation at their core, but also people are kind of they're living. Many people are earning their living this way or losing their earnings this way. So I'm curious, like, was it intentional for you to to set that aside and have the conversation that you did, or is that how does that fit into your mental model?
Yeah, so partly the truth is that partly when I was writing the book, I mean, it took a few years to actually write the book, and I finished writing it a couple of years before its publication. It was before the big explosion of some of those spaces that you describe. So that's partly the reason why I think I would have engaged them a little bit more as interesting examples of that speculative behavior in finance. But at the same time, they would not have been at the center of my argument, because my argument is intentionally a bit broader about that everyday culture and the everyday sort of social implications and political implications of speculation. But having said that, I have reflected on things like, I mean, something that it's perhaps overly used as an example of these kind of collective speculative communities, which is the GameStop saga and this very explicit attempt to of kind of a mass shorting, and to give this a political spin, and how folks within Reddit and other social media coordinate these kind of sabotage attacks, which I think my reflection and what I add to that, again, this is something that has been the ground of a lot of debate about, is that kind of event representative of a different kind of speculator? And indeed, again, there are a lot of critics that see those speculators as also, this culture, part of this culture of crypto bros, and there's all sorts of problematic aspects like sexism, racism, and being part of those cultures. I think that, again, the speculative community's lens, what could offer in reading events like that would be a shift of attention towards what makes those people kind of come together, and I think it's very important to ask the question: what drives a kind of speculative event like the GameStop saga, beyond the kind of the opportunity for making a huge amount of money into very quickly. That is part of the story, but I don't think it's the full story, and we miss the craving for connection. That is also, and it's also about an answer to the kind of status quo within finance, right? And it is a collective answer, and it's coordinated as well. So I find those elements very interesting. But when it comes to the forum that you discuss and Bitcoin and the sort of decentralized platforms and their potential, I simply have to confess that these are not areas that I have sufficient knowledge to make comments about their role in that picture that I'm trying to paint. I think they're relevant. What I can say, Ian, and I'm really curious in your thoughts and how you see the connections. What I can say is that I've been reluctant to delve into these worlds, because I'm also mindful of some of what I described at the beginning of our conversation, the naivety that I see in some observers, that I'm always skeptical about celebrating the new in terms of, I'm sympathetic to the decentralization argument, as you will have guessed, but I'm also mindful of seeing it as another form of deterministic kind of solution. And so, I think there are deep problems to do with inequality of resources, that we don't all have the same access to, inequality of, opportunities, education, material security. And I think these are important questions for a speculative community. And I'm interested in hearing also from you, whether you see in those spaces you describe opportunities to address that community aspect in powerful ways.
Yeah. So let me share a few thoughts. I'd love to to engage you more in this and talk to you more about this, because I think that you'll find some really interesting things when you look under the covers here. First of all, I always say that, people who, you definitely have to kind of dive in relatively deep to see what's actually going on. I always make the joke that, if you read an article in the Wall Street Journal about Bored Apes and then make up your mind about NFTs, it's like listening to the song Despacito and making up your mind about music, right? It's actually like kind of an irrelevant, top level phenomenon that doesn't expose, what's going on underneath. And I think, the interesting thing, I think that so much of what you have, first of all, I think it's actually very fortunate that you did write the book that you wrote without touching these subjects. It actually makes it kind of clean. You haven't touched that third rail at all. And it's also, so because you're either going to have to go all the way into it, which is going to be super complicated, or you're going to touch it in that Despacito kind of way, which is going to not do it justice, and you're not going to get to the heart of it. So I think actually it makes your book, both for me, more challenging to kind of get my head around. The reason that I had such a that I found it so challenging for me personally is that I do have this view about the way technology has changed culture, and it has to do with this kind of proliferation of information and consumer choice, and moving us from mass markets to niche communities, and what that does, and then throwing the word speculation on there, but not going into the speculative asset place. It's like, wait, we're almost there. So, but I like personally that I had to kind of, get my head around that in a way that was really about the way that we're changing as humans, because we have, this choice and this new way of storytelling, this new way of building community, and a new way of envisioning the future, which is, I think, kind of what you're getting at. That, what I always say in an oversimplified way is, like, when you reconnect humanity, you change humanity. And that doesn't matter if it's the printing press or, automotive travel, air travel, train travel, ultimately silicon chip and internet. When you reconnect humanity, you change humanity. So, first of all, I actually believe that I think Web 3 is a misnomer, because it makes it sound incremental to Web 2, when it's actually a separate technological revolution in the Carlota Perez technological revolution, sort of way. One technological revolution is this revolution of information, which was the internet, and now you have a separate revolution of value that's layered on top of that revolution of information, and that will be, incredibly disruptive. I think, the way to think about it is to go out to the eventual, reality that, ultimately your government document will be a digital document, and the way that you move borders is you prove you are the owner of the wallet that contains that document. And now you work backwards, right? So you say, okay, what happens when everyone has digital value? And then I think the interesting thing, and where you'll find some really fascinating things, if you look, not in these, like, and then, by the way, there are plenty of scams, shysters, make a quick buck sort of things out there. But if you set those aside and you say, okay, that's normal, you're always going to to have that. You're also always going to have more aspirants than success stories, right? I always use the example of music or writing. There are 100 million songs on Apple Music. There are only roughly 1 million that people love. We don't then say, oh, music is garbage, right? We recognize that there are a lot of people who want to be rock stars and there are fewer rock stars, right? So you kind of take into account all of those things, right? And then you look into some of these communities, like the generative art community specifically, and the world around that. There's an emerging AI art community. So if you look into, say, art blocks or FX hash and generative art, or you look into brain drops and the AI art community, and just within these, there are things that are very interesting dynamics. There's NFT art collecting that goes on in this community, a very relatively small community of people. It's on a chain called Tezos. It's on sites like object.com and Versum and FX hash. But right now, I was noticing this morning a whole bunch of artists posting art, and the proceeds are all going to people in Turkey. I was, texting with a Turkish artist that I collect on, Twitter today. I just said, "Hey man, how are you doing?" He wrote back, "Honestly, not good." Here's an artist I've never seen. I don't know what he looks like. I have tens of pieces of his art. I have a relationship with him. I have a patron artist relationship with him. I actually give him money regularly, right? So there's something incredibly fascinating, about this. And I also care about him as a human being, even though I've never met him, and so there's these layers inside of these, communities are quite real. And I think that, yes, these communities are very small today, but, to your point about online communities, and, you were mentioning the kind of Korean pop fans and Trump. I mean, I dropped out of grad school in 1995 to go on tour with the Beastie Boys because I was the guy who ran the Beastie Boys online community, right? So, I remember, 1993, 94, when, if I told people what it was I was doing, they would look at me and go, "Are you okay, man?" So it doesn't scare me that these communities are small today, because I know they'll be bigger tomorrow. I've seen this movie before, and it's what happens. There's like a fundamental human urge, and it comes back. That's why I like that you're pushing on. I love your example on both GameStop and the K-pop ones, because yes, there is either a political motive or a financial motive, but I completely agree with you. There is also this fundamental human need to be an individual, to be a part of a group of like-minded people, to feel that connection, to be a part of something. And I think it's when Balaji talks about, God to state to network, you really start to see parallels, right? People were members of religion. They were members of states and nationalists, and now they are members of communities. And for many of us, those community memberships mean more to us, right? The opinion of a person who is a member of one of my communities is like, could be more crushing to me as in my self-esteem than somebody else who is part of my government. Like it's not where my affinity lies. So I think that I love it. Actually, I really I would love to dig into it more with you over time, because I think you'll find a lot of what you're saying rings true. And I actually love that it's separate from your previous work. That makes I think it actually gives credence to what you do, what you would say, because it's not simply about the kind of the financial speculation. It's an extension of that. And I think if I could posit a thought exercise for you within that maybe connects the two worlds. I really believe, so we spend time talking to the Instagram team about what they have planned with digital assets, and it's actually quite interesting. I spoke last evening with Ron Ferris, who's running these things at Nike. So Nike has a dot swoosh, and I think it's very interesting to think about what Instagram and Nike might do here, because like what me and some other geeks are doing in this unknown world of it's like we're playing Dungeons and Dragons maybe, but when you think about Instagram and Nike, well, now we're really at a very pop culture level. And I think the way this might relate to the work you've already done is, imagine one of those influencers on Instagram, I think this will happen this year, instead of just posting a photo, they post a photo and say, there are 500 of them. It's $5. And when it's gone, I'm taking the photo down. Right now, you have a community that already exists, and they are suddenly engaging in speculation in a totally different way. Right. And it's not just, I'm sure at that case, it won't only be, oh, I've got to buy that. It might be worth $500 tomorrow. Right. They already have an affinity for whomever this person they're following is. And the opportunity to connect with them in a new way could be very exciting to them, completely separate from, well, maybe the $5 is going to become 500. Right. And so I think that is in a lot of ways the world that we're walking into, a world where that is possible. And just, one last thing, I'd be really curious what you think. I make a joke with my friends at Instagram where I say, man, if this happens, like, it'll be much easier for you to get out of bed in the morning, right? Because your job now is an advertising business, which is effectively stealing people's attention and selling it to someone else. And stealing is a crime. And imagine if instead Instagram became a value exchange between people who create and people who love the things that they create. It would be much easier for me to get out of bed in the morning if that were my job. So I'm imagining a world where there's some shift like that one, and money that might have been used to create content, to put into a channel to reach an audience, actually just goes directly to an audience. The value goes to the community. Like, there's actually a short circuit of that attention economy on some scale. Anyway, I think those are the interesting things. I'm curious if any of that resonates with you, and I'm really curious if you might like start poking on that direction.
Oh, this is all so very interesting, Ian. And I a lot of food for thought for me. I should say that I'm working on a new book project, which I call tentatively The Real Fake. And it's an attempt to, I think I will have to inevitably look into some of those worlds in greater sort of detail. It's an attempt to look at the force of distortion in our lives. So from speculation to distortion. And that's very, in the worlds of, I guess, AI-driven images and algorithms and NFTs. And it's not just a departure from reality. There's something about creating a new reality that really interests me. And so yes, I think partly my answer to you is not only is it inevitable, but I think can be extremely rich and generative to look into some of the platforms and the examples that you give. But I can also give you my more kind of immediate thoughts on what you say there about Instagram and moving, if I understand you correctly, from these kind of attention economy that is kind of extractive of the users to remobilization or weaponization of that economy for the community. I mean, correct me if I'm misreading you.
I think there's a potential for that. There's plenty of potential for bad as well, but there is a potential for value exchange and community ownership.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in that, and I see it as I think these are the avenues that precisely we should be exploring for opportunities. Like, I'm interested, I should say I'm interested in a better future for the many. I'm interested in a kind of radical vision of humanity that involves improving conditions for people that are deprived and live in circumstances that don't even allow them to participate in those kind of speculative communities that we're discussing. That's at the heart of what drives my work. So what I would say to the examples that you give is that I think it's fascinating, and I would even push it further, right? I would be interested to see how that kind of value creation through that relationship between the influencer and the user can lead to even more radical redistributions of value. I think there are so that's what I would say here is that I don't think that something like Instagram itself can be the sole vector, the sole kind of space for these kind of developments. I think it has an important role, but I would be very interested and curious in your thoughts on how to make the connections across platforms like Instagram and this type of attention economy and value creation, and deprived communities that lack the access to those very platforms. And so is there? I would put the question even more forcefully about radical change and how to spill over those kind of effects onto wider realms of society. And I hope that doesn't sound too utopian, but to me, it should be core in our rethinking of value creation and connections, and translating those connections into something bigger. I mean, for me, that's very important.
Even just last night, I had dinner with a big NFT collector, and he was telling me about one of his favorite artists that and he sent me the tweet later of the artist finally saying I finally quit my job and I've become a full-time artist. I mean, I think he was a Google engineer before, so I don't think that's exactly a redistribution of wealth or going from have not to have. But I know that for some of these artists that are in places like Turkey or Brazil, that these platforms have completely changed their means. But I think that that's by no means evenly distributed across any communities, right? So I think there will be a redistribution. I doubt that it'll be equal, right? I also think that there will be. I think that Balaji's construct of from state to network is largely correct, because we live our lives under network regimes, and these network regimes are global, but they are also stratified, right? And I think it's interesting to me. I mean, it's crazy but true. I mean, I own a U.S. passport. I also own a French work visa. That means I was able to move during COVID when many other people were not. And I own a proof pass, which is an NFT that gets me privileges in the NFT community that other people don't have. So I don't think it solves the problem. The technology does not solve the problem at all. I think it certainly creates opportunity, right? And that will mean opportunities for people who wouldn't have had opportunities otherwise. But technology has done that generally, right? I mean, my mom worked in a factory, and then she was a nurse. My dad was a fireman. I've had a completely different career because I studied computer science, and I studied computer science during the advent of the internet, right? So my earning potential was simply different, and that technology provided me a new opportunity. But everyone in my high school class from Goshen, Indiana, did not participate in that same opportunity. So I think it certainly provides opportunities, in that way. It also does provide this layer of abstraction, because what is interesting about the Instagram example is that when Instagram sells a digital collectible, that digital collectible is immediately available for sale on any platform, because it is actually a digital item on a blockchain. It is not a digital item owned by Instagram. It's not locked into Instagram world. It is something that was a sale that was facilitated by Instagram, just like a sale might be facilitated by Amazon. But the item now exists as a sovereign, item that can travel in this kind of frictionless international marketplace. So I think that there are some really, new dimensions. I'd point you to you might find interesting a podcast I did a couple of weeks ago with a guy named Yancey Strickler, who used to be the CEO of Kickstarter, and he has a new endeavor called Meta Label. Kickstarter was a public benefit corporation. Yancey is very interested in a more pluralistic society, and what he's doing with Meta Label is he is building tools for creators, but not single creators, tools for communities of creators, which I think might be an interesting direction toward what you're saying, because he's specifically sort of acknowledging that creativity is never just a single person on their own. It's usually a group of people, and you can actually create a creative community. It's what a record label has been. It's what Andy Warhol's The Factory was. As a creative community. And what are new constructs, or how might this technology create new opportunities for people to band together in new ways? I think that might head more in the direction of what you're interested in terms of creating a more pluralistic society. but it's, you have to acknowledge that, like fire or a brick, technology is merely a tool. I think the thing that interests me most, and there's one simple question I'd like to wrap on, but I think that the reason I enjoyed your book so much is because you show this, you show that we as humans are not as separate from technology as we like to think we are. Right. And that's a theme for me as well, is that we like to think of ourselves as these like sovereign creatures and technology is our tool. But the reality is that technology reshapes society and, the way you put it, reshapes humanity, from Homo economicus to Homo speculans, right? Like that's an evolution of humanity that is at the hands of the technology that we have available. So I think that will be the case. And sure, I would like to influence that for, a better outcome, but it's almost like saying, I want to be sure that, fire is used for good and not evil. Well, my dad was a fireman, so, we've done that in my family. But, I'm obviously not going to, cure the world of places burning down or people dying from fire, right? I feel the same with this technology. So I'm going to let you respond to that. And then just as a final question, I also found your book to be, there's a lot of references to great reading material in your book. I mean, one was Imagined Communities, which is a book I have on my shelf but have not read, if I'm honest. Also, you mentioned earlier books like Surveillance Capitalism, et cetera. I'm curious, what's on your, if you're going to send me away to, based on our conversation, to read a couple of books, what do you recommend for me?
Yeah, definitely. So just before I do that, just very, very briefly on what you were saying, I think, I broadly agree with you in the with the point about recognizing the inevitability and the inescapability of our technologized world. We can only, I guess part of what I try to say in the book is that there's no outside of that. There's this kind of this advice we hear in moments like this about, if only we kind of switch off our phones or, move to the countryside and, sure, there's something, live the bucolic life and, produce our own goods. I think these can be great things, but merely switching off, like that's an escapism that doesn't interest me. And so, we are, like you say, our lives are changing and we are agents of that change. I think that's an important acknowledgement. And
one point that I'd like to make on that is that, by the way, I actually I take a bit of offense at it. I would actually love to turn off my phone and move to the countryside. Now, if I have the privilege to do that, it's because I have the privilege to do it. If I am low income and hustling, I need my phone almost more than anyone else on the planet. So anyone who says, "Oh, I'm going to throw my phone away," it's like, wow, you must have a pretty great life, right? I hope I can accumulate enough wealth that I can actually turn my phone off. That'd be incredible. So I think it's worth recognizing that, the person who's delivering your food needs their phone, more than you do.
Exactly, 100%. I absolutely. This is a key point, and I would push that even a little bit further. And I would suggest that not only it's futile or even offensive, like you say, to suggest that switching off can be a productive way forward, but I would even say that articulating, producing a critique of the current unfairness and injustice that is embedded in our systems can only happen within those technologized worlds, using the tools that we are provided by these technologies. It cannot happen, this critique and this critical action cannot happen in this imaginary outside. I think that's a key point for me.
Totally agree. Thank you.
And maybe, my suggestion about what's on my kind of bookshelf, what I'm reading at the moment, I like one author that I would highly recommend, whose work touches actually an artist, James Bridle. I don't know if you've come across his work. He's also, I think he studied computer science, so he's also a technologist, and he wrote that book, The New Dark Age, a few years back. and which is actually, it makes some of those arguments about how we need to kind of embrace technology in different ways, whilst being aware about the pernicious aspects of this. But he wrote a new book now that I'm reading currently, and I think it's fascinating, which is called New Ways of Being. And it looks at different kinds of intelligence in that, both in the non-human world, so like plant and animal kind of intelligence, but also technological, artificial, AI type of intelligence. And he makes a fascinating argument about the need to move away from a kind of solutionism that, we need to kind of create the new technologies to improve our modes of modeling and intelligence, to one that we need to learn actually how technologies and different kinds of intelligence already interact. And some of he looks at examples of plants and insects, and how their patterns and rituals can be very interested in terms of like if you look at them algorithmically, and the kind of the intelligence they produce is very similar to some of our technological modes of intelligence. I'm not making justice to his argument; it's much more nuanced than that. But I think fascinating precisely from the perspective of thinking through creatively about connections and networks across different kind of agents of our very complex world, that are more hopeful as well, more optimistic.
That's great. I definitely will. That really resonates with me. I've read, it's funny. It's something that my wife and I talk about. That sort of plant intelligence as intelligence. Or the plant bias that keeps us from studying fungus. There is a lot of communication going on out there that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, and in many ways don't even know that much about. So I will definitely take you up on that one. Thank you so much. Aris, thank you so much for taking the time. Again, this was a bit of a flyer for both of us, and I really enjoyed it. And I thank you a lot for taking the time to talk to us on the ledger.
Thank you, Ian. The pleasure was all mine, and also I really enjoyed it. And I'm going to leave this conversation and go away and look into some of this fascinating material that you recommended for me. So yeah, thank you very much.
This content is provided for informational purposes only and is the sole expression of our opinion, and should not be relied upon as legal, business, investment, or tax advice. Do your own research. Any loss or profit is your sole responsibility. Stay safe.